All right, everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab. Welcome to our webinar on our new report, Advancing Equity in Utility Regulation. Slide 3, please. The report and slides are posted on our website. And I will put the link in the chat box to the report. And we're recording this presentation, and we'll post that recording at the link above. Because there are a large number of participants, all are in listen mode only, so please use the Q&A box to send us your questions and comments anytime during the webinar. I'll moderate Q&A following the presentations. Next slide, please. The Future Electric Utility Regulation Report Series taps leading thinkers to provide multiple perspectives on complex regulatory issues in the electricity sector. And the purpose is to inform ongoing discussion and debate. The U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Modernization Initiative supports the report series. And we want to thank our funders, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, specifically the Solar Energy Technologies Office, and the Office of Electricity. All of our reports, the slides, recordings are posted at the link that we show here. And I want to shout out to our advisory group that reviews the reports and helps us determine topics. Next slide, please. Our advisory group includes state utility regulators and state energy offices, utilities, utility consumer advocates, energy justice and social justice advocates, regional grid operators, and other non-governmental organizations and experts. Next slide, please. We've published 12 reports in the series so far. We've also got 3 other reports in the box here that were funded by this project. And our next report is on the role of innovation in the electric utility sector. I hope that that will be published in February. If you want to read more about that, see the appendix at the back of the slide deck. Next slide, please. Today, I'm pleased to present our 4 lead authors of the report. Chandra Farley, first, is the CEO of Resolve. It's a consulting practice with a mission to increase the impact of climate justice initiatives by creating equity-centered delivery infrastructure. Previously, she was the Just Energy Director at Partnership for Southern Equity, and she worked at the South Face Energy Institute. Next, we'll have John Howitt, who is a senior energy analyst at the National Consumer Law Center. He manages projects across the country, supporting affordable utility services and access by low-income consumers. Among his areas of expertise are design and implementation of affordability and efficiency programs, consumer protections, rate design, and advanced metering technology. And then we'll have Nidhi Thacker, who is the Director of Resource and Regulatory Strategy and Engagement for Portland General Electric. That's Oregon's largest utility. She leads the company's efforts on decarbonization and electrification, resilience and reliability, business model innovation, and customer products. Among her many previous positions, she was Chief of Strategy and External Affairs for President Michael Picker at the California Public Utilities Commission, and she also served as a senior advisor to the Loan Programs Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. And last but not least is Jean Su, who is the Energy Justice Director and a senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, a national conservation organization. Her litigation and advocacy work aims to hasten a renewable and just future. And she practices before both state and federal courts and commissions. So following my opening remarks here, they'll present for about a half hour in total, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. So please go ahead and enter your questions at any time in the chat box. Next slide, please. I'm going to take a few minutes just to provide a little context for what you're about to hear. And then we'll hear 4 cutting edge perspectives from our speakers. First, what do we mean by equity? In a nutshell, it's just and fair inclusion. And in the context of energy, it's the fair distribution of benefits and burdens of energy production and consumption. And equity extends beyond to justice, which refers to the goal of achieving equity both in the social and economic participation in our energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens for marginalized communities. States are increasingly recognizing equity as a goal, going beyond the traditional objectives to ensure systems are reliable, safe, and fairly priced. More and more states are recognizing this officially in legislation. My executive summary in the report highlights examples in several states that require or explicitly authorize states to take action on equity in all their decision-making or for specific types of decisions. And many states are using their existing authorities to take action on their own. Next slide, please. So utility regulation is an important vehicle to help achieve equity and justice in our society because it impacts equity in critical ways. For example, access to electricity and conversely, disconnection from utility service, electricity rates and rate designs, what costs utilities can include in rates and how those costs are allocated. In other words, who pays, and what costs are recovered in different bill components, such as fixed fees, which can affect how much money customers can save when they do take action to reduce their energy bills. Utility regulation also affects access to energy efficiency programs and clean energy technologies, and what energy resources and other infrastructure are built and where. And that impacts people's health, their property, community and environment, and overall, who gets a voice at the table. This is new for a lot of public utility commissions. And you'll see that nearly all of the legislation and regulatory issues that we talk about in the report are just from the last year or two. And these actions are really just a start toward addressing historical inequities and ensuring equitable distribution of benefits and burdens as we transition to a clean energy future. So I think we're ready to get started with our presentation. Chandra, would you please start us off? Chandra, you may be on mute.
Yes, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Chandra.
I am happy to be here to continue having this really important conversation around advancing equity in utility regulation. And as we talk about why equity matters, this picture is at the heart of what my perspective on addressing equity in utility regulation is really all about. This is a photo of some community engagement and some community meetings that I and many partners in Georgia created for community members to talk directly to commissioners during our last rate case, which immediately followed our integrated resource plan. And I think this gives us a really real picture of what we are talking about when we are talking about equity, that it is a strategic approach. I think that's really important because equity and justice can seem like a very lofty, intangible ideal, right? Particularly as it relates to energy and utility systems. However, marginalized groups and oppressed peoples feel the weight, the very real weight of inequity and injustice every single day. This has been front and center for me, particularly over the last few days and the last couple of hours, actually, as we're talking about voting. And when we talk about voting and the lack of political will to advance voting rights legislation, it's actually voting that I often use to explain the difference between equality and equity. Does every citizen of legal voting age have the right to vote? Technically, yes. But does every citizen of legal voting age have the same access, the same level of access to voting? We know that answer to be no. So then we begin to contextualize how equity and justice remain unevenly distributed and unevenly accessible or inaccessible. People, particularly those with decision-making authority, are generally white, wealthy, and male. These are groups that are statistically and historically not marginalized or oppressed. So when we have people in power that shape systems of distribution, shape pathways of access that do not have the benefit of a direct or informed lived experience overburdened by inequity or overburdened by injustice, then we have decision makers that do not have an informed view of what it means for systems of injustice or the inequitable outcomes associated with the lack of equity, then we begin to perpetuate these inequalities. And this is true of every system, food systems, housing systems, and yes, our energy and utility systems. So this is why advancing equity in utility regulation is so important. Equity is about making the space for discussing and investigating the why. And next slide, please. Why are things the way they are? As Lisa pointed out and was included in the announcement for this webinar, why do the various graphs associated with energy and utility systems and income and race show almost like a 30, 45 degree drop off when we look at these disparities? So when we see this, we can ask ourselves and we can remark, wow, why is this happening? So as regulators, as decision makers around utilities, what can we do to start closing these gaps? What can we do to start moving that line, right, from disparity out of those systems? So when regulators take their oath to ensure that people receive safe, reliable, and reasonably priced utilities, who are we talking about? Equity requires us to ask, safe for who, reliable for who, and reasonably priced for who? So this is really about what is encompassed in these top recommendations from my time at Partnership for Southern Equity, working with our energy equity advocates through what we call the Just Energy Circle, working with my friend Jean Sue on national energy justice initiatives, calling for a national moratorium on power, water, and broadband shutoffs, working with John Howard on consumer protections related to shutoffs, related to things like prepay. The more we start to ask our questions about who benefits, right? Who benefits is really what my work and the work of many of my partners is what we are pushing when we talk about the importance of public participation to advancing more equitable outcomes in utility regulation. So being able to bring in a community-informed perspective, those who have a lived experience of feeling the weight of disconnection, feeling the threat of not being able to provide for their families because they have no decision-making authority or no access to help inform decisions around rate increases or availability of energy efficiency programs that could help them reduce their bills. This is really, again, why equity and utility regulation is so important. And again, asking ourselves those questions when we talk about safe, reliable, accessibly, or reasonably priced, we must be asking ourselves who we are talking about when making those decisions. And I will stop there and look forward to the rest of our conversation today.
Great, thanks so much, Chandra. Next up, we have John Howitt with the National Consumer Law Center. John?
Thanks so much, Lisa. I hope the technology is working well here. I'm not sure about the computer here today, but in any event, National Consumer Law Center is a low-income law and policy group based in Boston with an office in Washington, D.C. And among the many issues that we work on at NCLC, energy and utility issues are certainly a big part of that. So I just wanted to start off with thanks. First to Lisa. Lisa Schwartz has just been incredible to work with. This project has really been enriching. It's generated a lot of good thought and conversation, and really urge you to download the report and take a look at it. It's a very rich document and reflects a lot of work and thinking from my wonderful co-authors here. So yes, thanks to Lisa for pulling it all together. I also would like to thank my colleagues at NCLC. This is really a group effort. Our chapter of the report was put together based on many years of thought and practice, and so this is a group effort. Jennifer Bosco, my colleague here at NCLC, initially was going to co-present with me today, but she was unable to join us, and sends along regards. So we took a look in our chapter of this report. We started out by trying to look at coming up with some analysis that would demonstrate the inequities that are baked into existing electricity systems. We looked at a lot of federal data, particularly from the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, and the energy insecurity metrics that are reflected in that survey. We looked at loss of heating, loss of cooling, frequency of foregoing necessities in the household, frequency of receiving disconnection notices. And we looked at all of these, data points by income, by race, and by ethnicity. And the findings perhaps are unsurprising, and completely consistent with what Chandra alluded to a few minutes ago. But we find that energy insecurity is really skewed by income. Folks who have very low incomes are much more likely to lose their heating and cooling service and having to forego necessities than their higher income counterparts. Similarly, when you break down these insecurity measures by race, we see much higher frequencies of receiving disconnects and losing service among African American headed households and other households of color relative to their white counterparts. Now, one thing we wanted to do in this analysis was to kind of break down the myth that, households of color have low incomes, and of course they're going to lose their service more often. Well, that's sort of a repugnant idea anyway. We can't just accept the fact that some groups have lower incomes than others and be okay with that. But even when you control for income and look at households only with income at or below $20,000, you see that the disparities by race persist, and this is very troubling. So I think what we began to learn here in looking at all this information is that traditional cost of service regulation has resulted in tremendous disparities by race and by income, by ethnicity, and that purposive action is required to reverse these inequities. The transition to cleaner electricity systems, cleaner energy systems, this is ongoing, and this is good. We need to pursue this transition with vigor, and don't have time to talk about that. But I think there's growing agreement that the priorities to transition to clean energy systems are really are a top priority societally. Well, the imperative also to reverse the inequities that are baked into the existing system should not be viewed as mutually exclusive. And we recommend that any proposal to invest in cleaner energy systems or or electrification include assessment of the equity impacts associated with that proposal. And that we seize the opportunities as these investments go forward and review of these proposals takes place by regulators and others, that we not separate the equity questions and the equity imperatives from decision-making around this clean energy transition. Next slide, please. Okay. I really would urge you to, again, to download this report, because we have kind of a catalog of tools that are available to reverse inequities. We look carefully at bill assistance programs that combine lowering energy burdens or electricity burdens on associated with current bills, and comprehensively addressing past due balances in a way that really allows for affordable access for all. And we believe we set out all kinds of principles and program design features for energy affordability programs, and would urge you to take a look at them. We also look at the need to re-examine and beef up the regulatory consumer protection structure that these are the provisions that deal with utility payments, utility billing, the right to payment agreements, late payment fees. And as we electrify, the need to beef up those protections against disconnect, or that limit disconnection, is imperative. We need the policy provisions in the consumer protection structure to keep up with the technological change that's ongoing so quickly. So there's a lot more in this report. And again, please take a look at it, and I look forward to the Q&A here.
Thanks so much, John. Next, we have Nidhi Thacker with Portland General Electric.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa, for that introduction, and to my fellow panelists for being here today. I also wanted to say thank you to LBNL and DOE for hosting this important discussion, and for the investment in this thought-provoking series of papers on equity and regulation. And before I get started, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my co-author, Jake Wise of Portland General Electric's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group. Over the last 2 years, this issue has become more prominent, as we all know, in our day-to-day lives, and has been exacerbated even more so by the pandemic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach to our paper, and then some of our key findings. So we approached our paper with the frame of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice, and the fact that, frankly, all three of those are really needed to have true energy justice. And in a nutshell, these forms of justice manifest themselves as procedural justice, or meaning ensuring that marginalized perspectives and communities are represented in the decision-making process. Distributive justice, or thinking about the distribution of those benefits and burdens of energy infrastructure and systems. And restorative justice, or repairing past and ongoing harms caused by energy systems and decisions. And maybe I should say attempting to repair, because I think we all recognize that the restorative piece of this effort and discussion is very challenging and difficult. And I think from the utility perspective, and as an essential service provider, we continue to strive to work to get that piece right. It's not without challenges and not without making mistakes, and we own those. And so I really wanted to I wanted to call that out here today. So if I could move to the next slide. So on this slide, we really highlight some of our major lessons learned. Thinking about our approach to community engagement through the lens of environmental justice, the need for proactive participation of environmental justice communities in our work, our day-to-day work, and in our dockets at the Commission. Providing financial support to community-based organizations so they have access to participate in our proceedings, whether they are at the Oregon Public Utility Commission or they are on a more informal basis. And considering distributive justice in utility program design and pricing. Partnering with local cities and counties to help them with their climate and sustainability action plans. There's quite a bit of opportunity there to work towards restorative and distributive justice. And as I mentioned, that this is really a learning process for us. I think some real key takeaways and lessons for us that we've highlighted in the paper are that, and these may seem very basic for our audience, but you have to be intentional to advance inclusivity and to achieve these forms of justice that we've laid out with procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. And I think you've heard my fellow panelists here today also talk about that need for intentionality. And to address issues with procedural justice, it's going to take resources, time, and budget. But it really also takes a partnership between the utility, its regulators, and stakeholders. And in Oregon, I would like to commend our commission because our commissioners and staff have really made equity a core priority of our day-to-day work. And that includes the recent hiring of a diversity, equity, and inclusion director, Isel Watson, for the Oregon Public Utility Commission, to really bring a more dedicated and an intentional lens to the work of the commission and the work of the utilities that are regulated by the commission. We also have to support intervener funding to bring more voices into the room. I think the reality is that even once our intervener funding program is fully up and running in Oregon here, we are likely going to have to make some additional tweaks to it to ensure that we continue to see the diversity of perspectives and voices in proceedings, that you need to have the type of robust engagement that's necessary to come to a decision that is inclusive and that really does provide all of our customers the opportunities that they deserve. And I'll just say, during my time at the California Public Utilities Commission, this was an issue I saw repeatedly. And it's interesting because the CPUC has a very robust intervener funding program. But in spite of providing funding, we still saw the same parties again and again. And I think that's a testament to, once you sort of solve the budgeting and the resourcing part of the equation to provide for more procedural justice and procedural access, you still have the potential to have an administrative process that is still quite unapproachable for many and requires a level of intentionality there. And at the federal level, I think many of you have probably seen the efforts underway by Chair Glick and Commissioner Clement to stand up the Office of Public Participation. And I think this is a really great example of how regulators can support procedural justice and promote a more inclusive process for all. So we also learned that you can make significant progress and learn a lot from engaging your customers, and that the benefits of this engagement are further enhanced through the utilization of community-based organizations as a conduit. And in our case, they really have served as a trusted party for our customers. As Chandra Farley on this panel with the Partnership for Southern Equity also highlighted in her paper, we have to be intentional about involving those impacted individuals, communities, environmental justice organizations in program design and evaluation, as well as utility resource planning. And I'll say at Portland General, we have really been leaning into this space quite a bit with our integrated resource planning underway for our next cycle. And we've held to date, I think roughly somewhere between 12 to 14 roundtable discussions with the hope that we continue to see more diverse faces in the room. And when I say diverse, I mean diversity of perspective and diversity in all regards. And we are also trying to be more intentional with our community engagement with our inaugural distributed system plan that we just launched. And then finally, I'd also note, by partnering with your local cities and counties to advance their climate and sustainability plans, you can address environmental injustices. I did mention there's quite a bit of opportunity here. We see a chance to advance good public policy with respect to decarbonization, but to also bring communities that have traditionally been disenfranchised and left behind and have traditionally been unable to access technology, innovation, clean energy opportunities along in this process. And then finally, as I noted earlier, this really is a learning process. We're testing new approaches, especially as we try to better engage with our customers and our communities. And through that, we're seeking feedback. And sometimes we are getting things wrong and we're having to apologize for those missteps, but we are willing to try again and again until we get that right. And we're also willing to own those missteps. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Nidhi, that was great. And finally, we have Jean Su with the Center for Biological Diversity. Jean?
Great. Hi everyone. Good morning, good early morning for those on the West Coast, and happy lunchtime to everybody else. My name is Jean Su, and I am the Energy Justice Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. And I just wanted to give a huge thanks to Lisa Schwartz and the Department of Energy and LBNL for putting together such a provocative and innovative series that is really asking so many deep questions. And as well as thanking all of my co-panelists who are now friends and colleagues in this fight for equity together. So I hope everybody has a chance to read all 4 essays. They complement each other really beautifully. And I think as the final speaker, I did want to just zoom out a second and talk about the context of why these questions are so deeply important to us right now. We're at the end of 2021, and I think everybody here is exhausted, especially exhausted of Zoom meetings. And, oh, okay, great. Sorry, my internet connection is a little bit shaky. But we are in an all hands on deck situation right now in the United States on at least 2 different levels. One is in the wake of George Floyd. I think that the country is going through a deep racial reckoning about what is going on and how the racial inequities perpetuate every single system in this country, and that definitely includes the energy system. And the second huge problem that we face existentially as a planet is the climate emergency. I just returned from Glasgow, and although there were solid side agreements that were made, we are still on our way to a pathway of several degrees Celsius higher than we can afford to avoid catastrophic climate change. And so both climate and our systemic racism issues in this country are 2 aspects that absolutely need to be addressed. So zooming down into why we're talking about equity right now in the energy system has a huge role to play in perpetuating the injustices that we are seeing both on the climate and racial end. And our paper today is specifically focused on how the energy system is doing that, what types of injustices are they perpetuating? And second, what can we do about it? Like, what can we actually do in this all hands on deck situation? So let me just zoom into the first aspect of giving the picture right now of the energy violence that we are seeing across the country in different ways. So I think if you are a low wealth family in the United States, you experience the injustices of the energy system in at least 3 different ways. The first way is, as everybody knows, in terms of the incredible data out there, low wealth families in communities of color disproportionately live closer to fossil fuel plants than white counterparts. There's been a history, an incredible history of environmental racism in this country with where polluting sources are, and low wealth and BIPOC families are in the center of that. So one way of energy violence is essentially the pollution that folks are feeling from the fossil fuel complex that we are living in right now. The second is, as John was saying, and Chandra as well, the great energy insecurity that comes with the energy system. So we have a situation here where, again, BIPOC communities bear greater energy burdens and thus greater threats of utility disconnection. And our energy system is perpetuating those types of inequities in the way that we have structured our rates. And the third way that many people have not completely wrap their heads around is the climate impacts that families of color feel in the US. I just want to take a moment to recognize what has just happened in Kentucky and in the Midwest, but all over the country, we have seen abhorrent climate emergencies erupt in the last 2 years, whether it is the wildfires happening in the Pacific Northwest, or the Texas freeze, or the hurricanes and floods happening in the Southeast. All of these are raining down on the United States. And again, they are disproportionately hitting communities of color, where Nitty is in particular. We saw a horrific facts, essentially, and statistics that families of color living in Portland actually experienced 25 degrees higher in temperature around them than their white counterparts, leading to incredible crises in terms of access to air conditioning and basic public health circumstances. And the fourth, those are 3 ways in which families of color feel different types of energy injustices, just from the energy system alone. The fourth aspect of this is ecocide. Somebody asked what ecocide means. So the definition of ecocide is essentially how human activity has led to ecological destruction, grave ecological destruction. And it's no surprise to everybody here that, again, the fossil fuel system, the majority fossil fuel system that we have in the United States has perpetuated ecocide. It has been shown now and predicted that because of fossil fuel extraction and climate change, we are on track of losing 1/3 of the species that now exist on planet Earth. In 50 years, we will be losing 1/3 of those. So climate change is leading to this type of ecocide. Greenhouse gas emissions from our energy system is a key driver of that change. So given that context, the question is, what can we do right now? What power do all of us have right now to actually make a dent in our energy system to change it? Our electricity system in the United States consists of 30% of our total greenhouse gas emissions in this country. So we really have a desperate mandate to actually act to shift our electricity system so that it is majority, if not all, clean and renewable energy. So there's 2 pathways that I wanted to present in this paper. And Kristen, if we can get the next slide, that would be fabulous. Great, thank you. So the first is taking into consideration how in our energy regulatory rulemaking right now and decision-making, how do we actually think about the different types of energy injustices when we do this type of decision-making? And my top recommendation in this as a lawyer in the field is to actually adopt and solidify a far more expansive definition of public interest. So if public interest is the basis of how regulators deal with the regulation of utilities, and actually all statutes mandate that utility commissioners and the FERC as well has a very basic mandate to protect the public interest when they are regulating energy and energy players. the specific definition of public interest is not standardized across the country. It is a 50-state and federal morass of many, many different things. And there are certainly areas and states that are pushing the public interest definition in a really healthy way, and others that are completely void of issues. The original intent of the public interest and that drive for what regulators should do was all based originally on how our electricity system came about and originated. The public interest at that point and serving the public interest was actually a question of energy democracy. It was an issue of making sure that to serve the public interest, everybody, no matter who you were, had the ability to access electricity. And that type of energy democracy motive was one of like the driving factor and the defining criterion of public interest when that concept was originally made. But since then, and since the decades of electricity regulation, the question is whether that public interest mandate is actually still being met today, when we have an electricity system that is majority fossil fuel, and it is perpetuating the types of energy injustices that we've already discussed here. So the idea is that we actually need to open our eyes again and open up the box of what public interest means. And this is where we should be pursuing definitions that include energy justice, climate justice, renewable energy, and ecological justice into that definitions. There are a few ways that this definition can be pursued. The first is legislative fixes. So right now we have many different, it's a 50-state game and it's also a federal game. And there are key ways that if we have progressive legislators or legislators who just care about these justice aspects, that we can actually get some type of fix in terms of defining and expanding that public interest to include addressing these injustices. As we all know, legislative fixes, especially on a federal level these days, are extremely difficult. So there are other pathways. Another pathway is to do regulatory rulemaking. Some states may have this option, some states may not. And FERC certainly has this option as well. And this is to actually pursue new regulatory rulemakings where there is going to be public comment from all stakeholders, where we can collectively define what the public interest means so that we can get everybody on the same page about this all hands on deck urgency to address these energy injustices. And the final way to consider is to actually tie these forms of injustice and consideration of it into current duties that generally exist for utility commissioners today. So for example, utility commissions have a series of duties that generally are pervasive across all 50 states. One of them, for example, is to address undue financial risk that has to be a level and a part of decision-making for utility commissioners. Undue financial risk today actually has a huge difference from 3 decades ago. Climate risk is a huge part of undue financial risk. We know that stranded assets currently, the climate disasters that are wreaking havoc on infrastructure, energy infrastructure all across the United States, all of these pieces in climate are having reparations and, repercussions on the repercussions basically on the level of risk that private corporations are feeling and private utilities. So a commission can actually take into account the decision-making on whether they want to do a piece of new fossil fuel infrastructure or actually pursue renewable energy instead, all within the calculation of trying to protect customers against undue financial risk. So that is an example. Another example is that all commissioners essentially are required to make just and reasonable rates. And as John was just outlining for all of us with his incredible data set and findings, we know that how rates are designed right now are very much in the playing field of utilities. They are done through looking at the costs of utilities, looking at the reasonable rate of return for utility shareholders. It's very much on the side of the utility. And it doesn't right now systematically look at the impacts of that flat rate on different communities. There is going to be disparate impacts, as John told us, depending, unfortunately, on the color of your skin in this country. So given that, in the just and reasonable rate discussion, there can be new types of decision-making processes where we are looking at how to address those inequities, how to address the fact that utility disconnections are disproportionately a threat for BIPOC communities. So that's one bucket of looking at the public interest and how we can pursue a more progressive and expansive definition. The second piece is about adopting the technologies and policies that will try to address these types of energy injustices. The first, of course, is making sure that energy efficiency measures are out front and center in the types of technology fixes that can be done relatively affordably and now. One of the most important findings on a federal level that we have seen is that the Weatherization Assistance Program is woefully underfunded by multiple times than LIHEAP. LIHEAP, of course, is absolutely important, and it is essentially a Band-Aid for families. And a lot of families have so much trouble actually accessing LIHEAP in and of itself. In contrast, the Weatherization Assistance Program and the implementation of energy efficiency technologies is an alternative pathway that essentially creates long-term systemic solutions to households so that they can have safer, more energy efficient homes where they can be more conservative of energy, and it essentially protects their public health over time. The WAP program in particular is a way that one energy justice scholar puts it as a way of restorative justice for this country, as opposed to Band-Aid financial assistance. The second technology that is no surprise to anybody here is the perpetuation of DERs in this country. Distributed energy resources in the form of community and rooftop solar and microgrids and storage have so many consequential benefits to families and communities in this country. One, it actually can help move us to the renewable energy future that we need and close the frack gas plant or the fracking platform right next to families. Two, it is and has shown to be affordable to communities. Three, it has shown to be climate resilient. We have actually seen in different hurricane scenarios that families who actually had storage and rooftop and community solar didn't lose their electricity at true times of fatal consequence. And those three together are ways that DERs in particular perform such a resilient and restorative source of justice for this country. So the way that utility regulators can help with that are many-fold. One is to, again, include DERs as a way of forwarding the public interest when you are considering public interest in your decision-making. When you're judging that IRP or looking at that CPCN, is this really the best way to get our energy source? Or is our fossil fuels really the best way to do that? Or are DERs a far more just and equitable technology for us to pursue instead? The second is that right now we are seeing, and California is a good example, obviously tons of opinions about California, but one line of argument is that the California issue right now may obstruct continued deployment of DERs. Again, we have to urge utility regulators to consider these potential obstructive actions and how to deploy DER instead of obstructing it. And the third, which is very important as well, is that in light of all these climate disasters that are happening, there is going to be a wreckage and damage to fossil fuel infrastructure. Should we take those moments of disaster and actually build back justly by putting forth DER and energy efficiency technologies instead? These are all issues for utility regulators, for utilities, and for all the advocates here, and all the communities that this affects. And these are all in a package ways that we should be prioritizing justice in all the decisions on energy that we make. And with that, I'll zip it and we'll turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And if everyone can come up on camera now, we'll spotlight all of you and we'll get to so many questions. We're not going to have time to get through all of them, but we do have 35 minutes. And so I'll ask you to try to keep your responses concise so that we can get more than one perspective on many of these questions. I'm going to go reach back to Chandra, who we heard from at the top. of our webinar. Chandra, one of the questions I wanted to ask is how can advancing equity in utility regulation actually benefit the utility and not just utility customers and society?
Thank you, Lisa. So I think first and foremost, the bottom line, right? Utilities are concerned with their bottom line. And we know that business decisions grounded in a foundation of equity and inclusion and diversity positively impacts the bottom line. So I think that's one. If we were to dive down in the weeds of, which I'm sure that Needy could speak to and more of a technical perspective, as Jean lifted up, as we're talking about more distributed energy resources, we are talking about less pressure on our grid, which is less pressure on our transmission systems, which also positively impact utilities' bottom line. So I think there, those two different ways we can talk about it, clear that equity, diversity, and conclusion positively impact business bottom line, and then to the technical relief that utilities can feel as we transition our energy systems.
Thanks, Chandra. And I want to give Nidhi an opportunity to speak to that too. How can the utility benefit from the efforts that your utility and others make?
Sure, Chandra, I appreciate that perspective and thinking about it from the perspective of just the bottom line. I would say our bottom line is that we're an essential service provider. So, it is at the core of our business and fundamental to why we exist. And that means we are required to provide affordable, reliable, and safe service to our customers. And, I think we really seek an opportunity to provide for the public good in a manner that's going to seek to be just and reasonable. And I think what we're realizing is that we have an existing social contract, and that social contract is needing to evolve. And, it's incumbent upon us to reconsider how a historically purely economic approach to ensuring social and economic value is having to change in this day and age. And that's going to happen so we can really ensure that all of our customers participate in a clean energy future. And Chandra, to your point about distributed energy resources, I think that's a great example of an area where we continue to seek to try to deploy more customer-sided opportunities in that respect. And I think what we're seeing is there's quite a bit of opportunity out there, as has been evidenced by our testbed project, for example. But what we're also seeing is that rate design is an area that also has to come along and evolve and follow to help support what utilities want to do. There are quite a bit of utilities out there actually that want to better empower their customers, all customers, not just a certain subset of their customers, to have access to these clean energy resources. But our traditional sort of economic regulation and the models and the rules and the constructs we have that currently exist define, for example, cost effectiveness in a certain way that doesn't always work in this day and age. So what we're finding is twofold. One is we are having to go to our commission and work with our regulators in how to better create the kind of regulatory paradigm we need to harness those clean energy and distributed resources for our customers. And then the other piece of it is how are we engaging with our communities? How are we better learning what they need? And I think that's the core area that we learned quite a bit about in our test bed. And I mentioned in my earlier comments our CBO partners, and those CBOs have been critical conduits for us to better understand what our customers are seeking, how, what do they need. I think the reality is there, in the past, there has been, an existing dynamic that continues to perpetuate where sometimes customers don't trust their utility and they don't feel like they can speak openly with them, and they don't feel like there is an opportunity to engage in a way that as a service provider we would like to see. And so that's where our CBOs have been really a critical tool that have helped support some of those engagements and those conversations that we need to have to better understand what our customers need.
Thanks, Nidhi. We've had several questions about how do we get equity. You know, our report series focuses on electric utility regulation, but how do we, you know, with increasing dynamic between natural gas and electricity, particularly with respect to building decarbonization, how do we ensure equity across both the different fuels, electricity and natural gas, with respect to building decarbonization? And we've also had questions come in about across all utilities. Let's bring in water, for example. So who wants to start that discussion? Because it's pretty critical right now. And there are some concerns, especially in the equity area, that, you know, our low-income households going to get left behind holding the bag on the gas side. John, you want to get us started?
Sure. Thanks a lot. This is, I think we all know this is a hot topic and such an important one. Lower income households are, traditionally the last to adopt new technologies with, in the energy efficiency space and now in the distributed energy area. And so how can we ensure that these same folks aren't the ones left holding the bag? The shrinking customer base of these gas companies. And I think it's important to look at every electrification proposal that goes before the regulators and, for other structures of utilities, goes before decision-making bodies at those utilities. For every electrification proposal, and this gets back to Chandra, equity is about people and it's about outcomes. And so there needs to be an equity impact assessment associated with each of these proposals. And if we find adverse impacts by race and by income, then there needs to be mitigation of that. And frankly, we have the tools for mitigation. I don't think bill assistance programs are just a Band-Aid. I'm, talking to my friend Gene here. But we know how to what works in reversing inequities. And if you've got a decarbonization proposal that might make things worse, even in the short or middle terms, then I think, we have to put our heads together and look at what the tools that are available to us are, and to ensure that those approaches are implemented simultaneously and not separate. Not separate.
We've got a lot more questions coming in, but I want to see if anybody else wants to comment on this. It's a big issue.
Could I comment on that, Lisa, real quick?
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief. I'll just say when I was in California, this is 4 or 5 years ago, this was an issue that was front and center. We're now confronting it in Oregon as a utility that's looking to fully electrify, to provide our customers 100% clean energy by 2040 and to go totally net zero by 2040. Again, an issue very top of mind for us. What I would say is, we have to just be intentional about how we approach it. We have to be intentional about the types of benefits, rebates, opportunities that are accessible to certain sectors of our customer group. I think rate design can be a helpful tool here, but I also think we almost need to up-level it one more level, which is we need direction from our state decision makers. Our legislators need to be more intentional about this. When we talk about electrifying, to the extent that there are new state policy mandates passed, a subset of any benefit that goes to taxpayers within the state and ultimately customers needs to really kind of focus on disadvantaged communities. They need to be able to access a dedicated amount of funding that can be used to enable electrification. The California legislature did that when they were exploring building electrification. I think that's been helpful to some degree, and I'm just giving that as an example of one of the key areas that we really could use help from our decision makers.
Great, thanks, Anita. Jean, did you want to jump in quickly?
Go ahead. I did. So John, I am so sorry. I did not mean to like do like heap. It's both and like love like heap. We need WAP as well. So I'm so sorry for that derogative term. Okay, but on this issue, one of the key pieces right now is that all of these utilities cannot be disaggregated anymore. Everybody has their own lane. And from an advocacy level, I know there's so many advocates on this call right now, everybody's dealing with this separately. One of the best parts of, as Chandra was saying, our campaign together was focused on electricity, water, gas, and broadband. It was all together because it's actually the same families who are feeling the hurt on all sides. And I think what we have asked for is solid legislation and regulation over all of those utilities at once. These are basic human rights, everyone. I know that's very hard for people to understand, but we literally have a study that showed us that had a nationwide moratorium been put on power and water together during COVID, it could have saved 15% of lives. So I think that this requires regulation on all fronts and concerted systematic legislation for all these utilities together.
All right, thanks. I'm going to move on to a wholly different subject that really we hit pretty hard in the report, and that is siting. So Chandra and Jean, you both in particular talk about siting energy facilities. And if you could speak to how can state siting authorities, and sometimes they lie with the Public Utility Commission, sometimes it's a separate authority that might lie with the State Energy Office. But certificates of public convenience and necessity also, clearly a PUC activity relate to siting. So how can state siting authorities improve consideration of equity, extending all the way, through justice issues in their decision-making under existing state laws? I want to start with Chandra.
Absolutely. I think one thing I want to lift up as we talk about comprehensive, coordinated, systemic regulation. The Georgia Public Service Commission, under its transportation division, it has a cooperative agreement with the Department of Transportation, with the Department of Natural Resources, and several other agencies. So I think that is key when we are talking about utility regulation, that we understand how many other issues and areas that it touches, and sees every opportunity for cooperative agreement, collaboration, as we are looking at these issues. And siting in particular, if we look at the history of environmental justice and how those issues really came to the forefront, it was about pushing back and fighting back on the siting of toxic facilities, right? And even it's been interesting over the last year or so to see some stories bubble up where and perhaps opposition seizing upon opportunities to tell stories about marginalized communities or Black communities or low-income, communities pushing back on large-scale solar installation or pushing back on opportunities. And what I think it is important to understand about that, it is not about solar. It is about a community who is directly next to or sited next to a project, not being involved in the process and understanding the opportunities to have a voice in that process and being included in that decision-making. So when we talk about siting, understanding that as an environmental justice issue and understanding that there has to be coordinated collaboration and these cooperative agreements to ensure that we are addressing the equity question. And quite simply, to John's point, what do equity assessments look like? That's a very simple question. Who benefits? When you ask the question, who benefits, and the answer does not include a marginalized or oppressed group, then there are no benefits.
Thanks, Chandra. Jean, you want to comment on the siting issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So just plus to Chandra. Chandra took on the environmental racism part. The wildlife part is also very critical to all of this. What we're seeing right now is that large-scale renewable energy projects are primarily being deployed in the West, the Wild West. And those happen to be some of the most critical spaces of ecological just of the ecological significance in the country. So we have deeply imperiled species in the desert lands and sage grouse in the West and all of these places. But the idea is that the siting of these types of renewable energy projects needs to take into account, obviously, both the social impacts as well as the ecological impacts. And we have things like CEQA, like the California Environmental Quality Act, to help with that, and other similar acts, not as enforceable though, in other states too. One of the important parts, I think, about both what Chandra and I are saying and kind of the little kind of needle, the way to thread the needle, is the DER question. The DER question and building out DER on spaces that are already built, like one's rooftop and community, actually helps avoid exactly these types of siting issues, because we are not going to be perpetuating those types of harms both on communities and wildlife. We actually can get DER in already built spaces and bring home the local economic benefits and the local social benefits and the climate resilience altogether.
Great, thanks. I want to move on to a whole another area. We could probably talk for days. This is great. I want to talk about intervener funding, near and dear to my heart as a former Public Utility Commission staffer. Very important to get different voices on the record to be better informed and have robust decision making. Nidhi, first, do you want to talk about Oregon's recently passed legislation and what that did for intervener funding with respect to equity?
Sure. In a nutshell, I would say, as part of HB 2475, which is the low income rate that's being now implemented in Oregon, the utilities are providing for intervener funding. And I'll just talk a little bit briefly about HB 2475. I think there still remains quite a bit of work for us to get this off the ground in Oregon. But the utilities are working very closely with the commission and all of our stakeholders. And I think this is a really good example of where both the commission and the utilities are trying to ensure that there's enough space in the room to have the kind of conversations we need to have about what it means to stand up a low income rate or an income differentiated rate in Oregon, and to reduce energy burden through that process. So I'll say from the intervener funding perspective, interestingly enough, we're sort of still working around some procedural issues within the docket and trying to determine how we can put forward or deploy an income differentiated rate as soon as possible, because we think it would be very useful to our customers. With that said, we're having to balance process at the commission, ensuring we have an inclusive process, ensuring things don't feel rushed and parties feel like they don't have an opportunity to properly comment. So we're actually working with the commission right now to see if there's an opportunity to fund on an intermediary basis, sort of an intervener funding program before we fully stand up the program. So we're trying to think about doing this in phases and trying to sort of break off small chunks of how you try to get some differentiated rate deployed as soon as possible while still providing parties an opportunity to comment, and then kind of looking at a more robust effort to stand up this differentiated rate. And I would say we've also looked quite a bit to California to see how they had structured their programs. In California, looking at sort of the discount structure, whether it's a percentage of a bill discount, looking at enrollment recommendations, whether you can self-certify for an enrollment process or how that looks, because we are interested in ensuring we can expeditiously get our customers enrolled in a program like this once it's stood up, as well as thinking about the eligibility requirements and how we keep those in alignment with Oregon state and federal energy incentive programs that exist.
Thanks, Nidhi. We're going to come back to a low income rate in just a bit. I'm glad you introduced that, but I want to go back to the core of the question, which was intervener compensation. And to be clear, in Oregon, we have longstanding intervener compensation. Ratepayers pay for it. That one of the questions we had is who pays for this? It's utility customers. It's the residential ratepayer advocate has a right to intervene. We also have industrial customers that get compensated. Following, but part of the issue, John, I want to go to you. Part of the issue is, the way it's structured today, it's the organizations that already have the resources and the time and can risk, right? Finding out whether they get the intervener compensation later and how much they get, right? So in the report, you discuss an approach from Wisconsin, I believe, which is a little bit different. You want to talk about that in a moment?
Sure. I'd like to back up for just a second, if I may. You know, Chandra, I think there are a few chapters in the report dealing with this question of intervener comp, and there are different approaches in operation. California is sort of the one that people first look at usually when trying to adopt a new system, but it's very expensive, and not all states have got the rate base to support such a system. So, but to back up just for a moment, I think, yes, intervener funding is absolutely necessary. We need money to get more participation before regulators and others. There's also something I don't think we did address in our report, and that is the extent to which advocacy capacity is really an issue right now. We can have all the money in the world, but if someone's not ready to go up before the commission and face down all the white guys in gray suits who all know each other, you know, it's really tough. And the money alone isn't going to solve that problem. So we need to put our heads together and address this. And I just wanted to follow up with a quick sort of an anecdote. Had the pleasure of working with Chandra and Diana Hernandez from Columbia University just before the pandemic. And the idea of this project, and we had workshops in Atlanta and Chicago, the idea was to address this advocacy capacity issue and to get a majority people of color into the room, into a workshop, and to try to work with folks with some wherewithal to get before commissions. And I think we need a lot more work like that. And not just to hold a workshop, but to be able to provide follow-up support to really expand the capacity of folks to get before the commission, make the case, point out data shortfalls of a proposal that is before the commission. But it's hard and it's intimidating, and it's a real problem. There are too many folks doing this work that look like me, not only these white guys, but old ones, you know? So anyway, there's a lot of work to do in this area.
Chandra, do you want to comment on this intervener compensation issue? You're writing about the Southeast quite a bit, and how does it work in your neck of the woods?
It doesn't. It doesn't. What I was looking at were, the other states, mentioned here, California, Oregon, Wisconsin, and I'm excited about an opportunity to, potentially put that in front of our commission. But John's point is a real one. When I was at Partnership for Southern Equity, if we didn't have an organization like a Southern Environmental Law Center, a nonprofit, group of attorneys who were willing to take on groups like ours as clients at no cost for that, part to us, we would not, and those that we partnered with, like Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, would not be able to participate in those processes. So that is critical, something. But John's point is a good one, right? We funded my participation, the participation of our organizers. I mean, it's not just the stuff that happens in the venue in front of the commissioners, right? We had to have money to bring up our organizers and the couple of hundred folks they were mobilizing in Savannah, Georgia, 4 hours away. We had to have money to pay to bring all those people up to Atlanta for a couple of days at a time where these regulatory proceedings are taking place, right? Let alone, what may have been 6 hours away, further south. And then also that year of process, the integrated resource plan, which is about 6 months. Then you have another 4 or 5 months of the rate case. We almost literally have to stop work, right? I mean, technically that really doesn't happen. It's a whole other layer of work on what you're already doing. So even in grant funding and talking to foundations now, it's like, if you can't pay for me to have a whole other entire person, then we just cannot participate, or this group just will not be able to participate, because you can't afford to stop all of the other work that you are doing. And you certainly can't wait 8 months for your money to, help pay for that expert or help pay for that staff time. So I think it's an incredible model. And I think there's got to be, and I'm glad to be learning from other groups who are getting it right. And I think that's a important opportunity that we can continue to refine.
Thank you. Nidhi, did you want to jump in quickly here?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the issue of process here, because we're talking a lot about funding the participation of individuals in proceedings. But I do think, having worked at the commission and now being at a utility, one big gap that we're really still not addressing is how complex the process is and how people even begin to understand that. And that's why I mentioned the FERC's Office of Public Participation, because I do think that other state PUCs are looking at how they can stand up similar offices to help engage with their stakeholders, not just those who they regulate. And I wanted to just call that out, because I do think that's a critical piece of trying to address this problem that we have.
Great. I want to move on. We have so many good questions. I want to talk about the public interest definition, and I want to start with Jean. A fundamental point you make in the report is that, and this is just in my own words, state utility commissions really could push the boundaries more on this issue. We do have a couple of related questions that came in the Q&A box. So one is, maybe make it more real by providing a specific example, maybe a case that you worked on, where the public interest definition allowed for increasing adoption, of distributed energy resources in underserved or low-income communities. And also, just what advice do you have for state utility commissions who really want to do something and are a little nervous from the legal, from your attorney's point of view? What can you say to them?
Yeah, so we tried to do a survey actually of how much public interest has been pushed in different commissions. And unfortunately, there didn't turn up anything significant in terms of public interest definitions that were pushed in various dockets of being adopted in any meaningful way. So I just want to kind of caveat that this is a huge area of growth. And in that case, it's actually a very ripe field for advocates here to go for it, which is great. One of the things I think that utility commissions can do in particular is actually take a very active role in trying to define this. And one of the ways that is within some commissions' control, it's not 50 state proof, but is they can actually create a docket themselves, do a regulatory rulemaking to actually define this far more specifically, and bring in every stakeholder at the table to define that together. One of the very important parts about this is we don't necessarily want to be forwarding these definitions that will then be litigated like crazy by people, by utilities and others. We need to create an environment that is regulatorily certain. Utilities need to know what public interest means to commissioners. And then we can actually begin to systematically put those types of decision-making pieces together. One of the areas that we in particular are looking at is the FERC context. FERC actually right now under Supreme Court case law and DC Circuit case law actually has the ability to adopt something expansive. And the from a 1976 NAACP case against the predecessor of FERC, it was said that yes, the definition of public interest can actually include areas that are obviously related to FERC's main mission that also include environmental, economic, and social issues as well as antitrust issues. But that is actually in the law, that it is actually allowed for FERC to consider those types of issues systematically. And DC Circuit law has been brought up to the core where now FERC does have to consider environmental justice implications. So that definition, of course, is growing in case law, but what actually is probably the most kind of systematic way to do it, short of federal legislation, is a declaratory order from FERC that would define this explicitly.
Okay, Jean, how about if we turn to state regulation?
Yeah, so state regulation, again, I think that it is regulatory rulemaking and that it can be done through. Also, I think that utility commissions can start to include these pieces when they consider pieces like undue financial risk and just and reasonable rates and CPCNs. They can actually start to systematically look at factors like energy justice, environmental racism, ecological impacts, etc.
Great. Certificate of public convenience and necessity. And I urge you to look at the report. There are some very specific examples that may be helpful. We have 6 minutes and I want to get through 2 more questions with several of you. So let's go. This is a lightning round. We have John. I want to talk, I said I would come back to rate design. I want to ask you, if you had your perfect rate design for low-income households, you know, and you had the authority under existing law, or you had a new bill like in Oregon, where you could have a different rate for low-income households, how would you create it? How would you be mindful of cost to other ratepayers? How would you deal with components like fixed versus volumetric charges? All right, go quickly.
Okay, well, I think the percentage of income payment plan approach is the best hold harmless bill assistance mechanism that we've got out there. And we don't have time in the lightning round to talk about the details of a percentage of income payment plan. But as costs come in and rise, folks are held harmless if you're participating in that program, and it needs to be combined comprehensively with a past due balance retirement feature. So if you are timely paying the current bill, reduced current bill, you also have a portion of that past due balance retired. How do we pay for it? How about a uniform volumetric charge on all ratepayers' bills? It should be volumetric, not part of the fixed charge, and we don't have time to get into the details of that either. But I can add that, lightning fast, Lisa, but can add that people can get together in a room and discuss and come up with a good program design. It's all, you know, the fight is always how you're going to pay for it. And you know, and that's where the conflict arises. So, you know, it's not just coming up with that good program, but coming up with mandates for commissions and other decision makers to adopt and implement these programs.
Thanks. I want to give Chandra a chance to also address that question if she wants to.
I wholeheartedly support the percentage of income payment plan model. I think that we have to have a mechanism to stop the bleeding, quite frankly, and give folks in partnership an opportunity to not fall further into debt, fall further into energy insecurity. And this might be a little controversial, but we've got to look at things like return on equity. We've got to look at things like, we just, you know, gave the CEO of a utility, doubled his pay, $13 million right after we approved a rate increase. I mean, there's got to be some sort of corporate accountability as we talk about utility accountability related to things like return on equity and rates.
Thanks, Chandra. Nidhi, I want to go to at least one more question here. We have 3 minutes. You know, a lot of this depends on utility customers and communities that you serve trusting the utility. How do you build that trust with customers and impacted communities? And also, let's sneak in there another question here for you. How do you extend this to your shareholders, your board of directors?
Sure. So, okay, a lot to cover in a small amount of time. So starting with the building trust piece of it, I think I've mentioned this many times today. Our CBOs have been so critical in us developing that trust with our customers. We saw that in our we're seeing that in our distributed system planning. We are also seeing that in our smart grid testbed work. You know, we co-developed workshops with the Community Energy Project and Unite Oregon and the Coalition of Communities of Color. With our DSP proceeding, we've deferred to their expertise and compensated them to lead in these respective pieces. And I think that word deference is really important. So I'm going to call that out there. And then, you know, I'll say in the test bed, smart grid test bed work we did, we formed a community work group that included city leaders, community partner organizations, and test bed participants to also co-develop a project capstone. Again, there we defer to the expertise of the community and their unique lived experience, and that was really important. And Lisa, I'm going to actually ask you to just repeat that second question you had regarding the board and shareholders, just to make sure.
Yeah, just you know, you know, and it could be, you know, I wanted to start with you, but we don't have a lot of time for other people's response. But how do we diversify, you know, boards of directors? You know, can we have seats for community and environmental representatives, and you know, environmental, you know, and social justice organizations?
I'm gonna use the word intentionality, but you know, I'm gonna say, I think for just diversification of boards writ large, the sort of normal group of folks we look to has a very kind of small, you know, I would say a group of eligible folks who'd be considered for those board slots. So I think intentionality is key. I think recognizing that you know, we may need to value perspectives in a different way, value experience in a different way than we do right now to make up for some of the disenfranchisement we've had of certain groups of individuals in the past. But I'll stop there because I know my colleagues have quite a bit.
Well, we have 1 minute left. I want to offer Chandra and Jean an opportunity to respond to that or to say something that they wish they had time to say earlier. Chandra, let's start with you. Any comments on that?
Yes, I think that we have to, one word, courageous. We have to courageously embrace the idea of equity in utility regulation, and courageously embracing these ideals and principles means we are going to be uncomfortable, and means we are going to be faced with questions that we feel like we can't answer, but we are doing ourselves a disservice when we do not at least ask the question. And included in that list of questions is who benefits.
Thank you. Boy, we should just end there, but I want to give Jean an opportunity.
I was going to say we can totally end there, but I think the other thing I would add to that is also who pays. We know that during this pandemic in particular, we came out with a report that showed that utilities actually paid out $19 billion to shareholders and executive compensation during COVID, and only 0.5% of that they could have taken to save 1 million households from disconnection, but they didn't. So there is a huge question about who pays and what role the utility has to protect the human rights and the public interest that they're supposed to serve. I think on another kind of grand note, I just do want to say that there's so many collective minds on this call and out there. Every single state has so many different jurisdictions. And I think the important thing to note here is that we all should be aligned in a goal to create a just and as fast as possible renewable energy future as soon as possible. And utility regulators right now, and utilities and advocates, have jurisdictional powers that we may not know about. So everybody has to go out there and explore what powers exist legally and use them to their maximum. And that is the thing that we all need to do. Be creative, explore, and actually go for the thing that is the most common sense and just right now.
Thanks to all of you. It was such a pleasure working with you on the report, on our NARUC presentation, and our public webinar today. Wish we had time for more questions. We had terrific questions and responses. Look for our next report and public webinar on the role of innovation in the electric utility sector, hopefully coming out in February. Thanks to our U.S. Department of Energy funders, and thanks to all of you for joining today. Thank you very much.